Hello. How is everybody doing today? I hope my microphone is still working. Yes, it should. Okay, cool. So, welcome again to another lecture of the Summer of Nix 2022 public lecture series. Today we'll have Valentin talk about flattening the learning curve. And I think of especially some experienced Nixers and people that go a little bit back into history for Nix, documentation and the learning curve of Nix has always been a bit of a hot topic. So Valentin has actually been working on this and he'll introduce it, like what he's been doing and how you guys can help actually as well. Now, before we get started, this lecture, just as our mains lecture in the past, was pre-recorded because Valentin couldn't make it live, which is fine. But just for people that have questions, you can still post them on YouTube and LinkedIn and the Owncast instance, and I'll try and relay them into the Matrix channel. If you want to ask your questions directly into the Matrix channel, that's also fine, because after the lecture, Valentin will still try and see if he can answer some of those questions on Matrix. So know that the questions this time will be answered on Matrix, just as with our mains talk. To keep the flow, however, we have included a very small portion of Q&A from some internal colleagues. And yes, without further ado, I'll start the video. I won't keep you guys waiting any longer. So enjoy the video and I'll see you in a bit. To the Summer of Nix 2022 public lecture series this year. I have heard that you're going to talk to us about a little bit about the documentation and the learning curve of Nix packages and NixOS.
Yeah, exactly. So my name is Valentin. I work for Tweag. I joined Tweag beginning of this year. And the question was, what could I do as long as I don't have a client project that I can work on? And Tweag has this internal Nix team where we develop the product and help onboard our own coworkers working with Nix because it's a daily staple tool in the company. Mm-hmm. And well, I joined Tweag as a Nixer because when I discovered the project that's a couple of years ago, I finally found something that I was looking for a long time, a tool to make computers work reliably in the long run. And if you know Nix, once you have built something, it will work reliably until you change it and not change underneath your feet without you intervening. And as anyone who tried to approach the system knows, it's really hard to wrap your head around all the concepts that are inside it, starting with the Nix language or how packages work internally, how NixOS is configured, how you would work with multiple machines. And well, the learning curve, anyone who has tried it, it really is proverbially steep. It takes a lot of time to really grasp the thing well enough to be confident using it. So I probably took like 2 years before I was really confident packaging a new software that was not yet in Nix packages.
No, that's faster than I was.
Well, and when I observed new colleagues joining Tweag who did not know Nix at all, I quickly found that we have to do something about it. And I wondered, what would that be? And luckily, or I'm really happy that that Tweag leadership allowed me to spend some time on this, doing it properly. That's the other thing that I also observed. When I was spending that time on my own and my free time, it simply turns out the problem is usually too big to attack it on your own. Like if you spend a couple of hours here and there, you may maybe make notes on your own, or maybe fix a little typo here and there. But really changing anything about the big state of affairs, the big picture, is essentially impossible. The entire documentation ecosystem and how things are interconnected and how they are presented, it feels a lot like a jungle, I would say. And so you would,
I'll agree with you.
Yeah, so you essentially need to get everything of that in your head and then navigate through it more or less. And well, so I started essentially. So my presentation is a little bit ad hoc here. So this is my.
I will actually pull in your documentation. So
yeah.
Valentin will be talking about the documentation of NixOS, if that isn't obvious just yet. But I look forward to watching it, Valentin.
Yeah.
We will be right in the sidelines listening to you and watching you, and we'll be right back at the end for questions, okay?
Yes, please interrupt me at any time because, well, it's just like a little chit-chat about what's been going on in the past month.
Sure. Your slides should now be visible. There we go.
Okay, so essentially, this is just my internal project pitch, a little bit made up for public viewing. This is also the same thing that I submitted to the Summer of Nix, because it's all the same concern. Like, Nix is really hard to get into, and maybe if you've been around 2019 or so, you have seen this little post on Discourse, which has been adapted to NixOS. So I started figuring out what is actually the problem. Why is it so hard to learn to use Nix? And I started with a little survey on my own intuition. So one thing that is very, very prolific is Ian Henry's what he calls a let's play, but for obscure software documentation. I think it already says it all. If you read it, it's like 40 parts or something. It's essentially mocking how complicated Nix is set up and how confusing the documentation is often written. And I actually talked to him and asked him, well, why don't we change something about it? That was a year ago or so. And the thing is, if you went through all these notes, it would result in like hundreds and hundreds of issues or pull requests against the documentation. As I said, this is nothing a regular person can do on their own, or even in the spare time. So what would be the most valuable thing, the most important thing that we could attack immediately? Then I started just doing an overview. So what kind of data do we have? We had this NixOS survey in the beginning of the year, which essentially told us that a lot of people use NixOS, roughly half of the survey participants. And documentation is one of the most pressing problems that we have. I think Ron summarized it as documentation, documentation, documentation. I also went through these survey results because there's a lot of them, and helped kind of sorting out all the numbers, just to get an idea of where do people get stuck most. But that's still not enough, because, well, if you say, well, flakes are really complicated, I don't understand how they work, or if people say, well, I want to use NixOS, but it's really hard to get into because the Nix language is hard to learn, that doesn't really help. So I started doing user studies and observed newcomers to Tweag and some friends who haven't seen Nix yet, to see where they stumble exactly. And at the same time, I had to know what kind of resources are there even in the ecosystem. So I did a little survey of resources on my own and wondered, okay, what do we have? There's one thing called the documentation system, which kind of categorizes the types of documents from which people can learn how something works. And I tried to just figure out what kind of categories do we have in the ecosystem right now, and did a little survey. It's not entirely complete, and meanwhile I have found a little bit more. But mostly we have a lot of tutorials for the Nix language, some introduction to Nix packages, which is mostly the Nix pills, but at a very low level, and not all that much about NixOS. As far as I'm aware, there's no real overview on how NixOS really works. We have a bunch of how-to guides to solve actual problems, mostly those from NixDev, and John Ringer, who has been doing the talk last week, also has some great introductions. And also how to use NixOS, which is mostly in relation to deploying stuff and doing some configurations. But then the two other interesting things is what's the reference material? Like, how do we, like, where are all the important aspects of Nix listed down to every detail? And this is fairly clearly structured. NixOS has a manual, Nix packages has a manual, and Nix itself has a manual, and actually it's split for the Nix commands and the Nix language. But if we dive deeper, it's actually both instructions and tutorials and a little bit of explanation here and there. It's not really clear cut. But why Nix is that way and how it really works internally is only really explained in Elko's PhD thesis. And this kind of made me wonder, may that be the reason why people struggle understanding Nix so much? Because that is anecdotal still, because when I started using Nix, the first thing that I've actually read was the thesis. And by some incident, exactly in that same year, disappeared from the front page of, or from one of the pages of the NixOS website. And since then, I've constantly had people complain, like, Nix is too hard to understand. It's hard to learn. I don't know how it works. I only copy-paste code. And well, not all of the people are crazy enough to actually read a 200-page PhD thesis. But the most important thing in this thesis is really how Nix works in principle. And that is just that the file system in Nix is considered to be used like the memory system in a programming language. And that was the thing that hooked me most when I got into Nix first. That we could solve the entire problem of not just deploying, but also building software if we stop thinking in terms of files which have changing contents, which may just not be there or be something else than we expected, and just pretend that the dependencies that we have for building our software work just like pointers in a computer program. If we nail them down more properly, instead of just changing and writing onto them and like moving them around freely without all of that much discipline, then we would solve a ton of problems that we had in the past, 40 years of open source software. So I kind of set myself on a, well, Theophan called it a crusade, to help people learn Nix in a more principled way. And okay, I said I already started doing these surveys. And while doing these surveys, I found out, and also talking to people a lot who had a lot more experience in Nix than I did, I found out that, well, maybe it's not all that far-fetched or high level as I might think. It turns out that people usually have much simpler problems which they already struggle with. For example, it doesn't really matter to people all that much how Nix works internally, whether it's a functional program, because most people who are interested in using Nix don't really care all that much about functional programming. They're mostly practical developers. And also, they don't have time to go through all these concepts that I try to lay out when documenting the underlying architecture. Like, it's a ton of stuff that you have to read and understand, and even if it's sorted out a little bit better, it's still a jungle. It's still complicated because it's a system that essentially tries to reinvent how we would build and deploy software. So what people really care about is, well, how do I get things to run? And that usually amounts to just typing nix shell-p and then finding the right package name. So the question was, how would we approach how would we approach people who want to get things done with Nix and still help them understand it well enough such that they can actually make use of it on their own at some point and navigate the jungle of documentation that we have. And this is when things kind of turned around. So my first idea was to, well, why don't we just write a book, like the Nix book, which will explain how Nix works fundamentally, and then show how you would use these fundamental concepts to build up something like a package, but in a more concise way, in a more user-oriented way than we had, for example, with the Nix pills, which people read as one of their first documents when they get introduced into Nix, and they get totally confused about the details because they don't usually matter. So I wondered, what if we did like a principled introduction to Nix and add exercises and questionnaires and test it with people who really try to use Nix. And when I actually started trying to test it with people who want to use Nix, it turned out they don't care all that much. And when I did my survey of existing material, I of course stumbled over nix.dev. I didn't stumble over it. It's one of the most prominent resources that we have because it has such well-designed, well-written, really concise, to-the-point tutorials that I thought these should actually be the core of whatever that book would eventually become. And And the other thing was that we have this large collection of tutorials that are compiled in the NixOS wiki, and both resources are actually unofficial, right? So Domin has this nix.dev that is going for many years now, and the NixOS wiki as well is at least, I don't know, 5 years old. And none of these resources are really official. And the question was, how would we bring this combined knowledge together to make most use of it? It's essentially a little bit like this, the same thing as Nix packages, where Nix packages, as John said, is this huge collection of organizational and procedural knowledge of how to build packages and how to organize all these things together. And what we probably need is something like this just for documentation, where we combine all the insights into how people actually use Nix and what they need to make most effective use of it and how to approach it most effectively. And this is why I thought, well, let's just bring all of these people together and make something like a Nix documentation team. This is the NixOS wiki. What would you call these people? Somebody gave me a link to this thing where they call themselves documentarians. And then I said, well, let's just become Nix documentarians. What would that entail? We would bring together all the information that we have in the ecosystem, all the people who write the interesting articles and the interesting tutorials and the reference material, sit down together and figure out what would a new way of learning Nix, what would a path on this journey into mastering the Nix ecosystem look like? So I did a bunch of drafts and proposals, what that could be. One of them would be, okay, so assuming that this is how you land on the front page and see some examples, how would you learn that? What we already have is that the website points you to nix.dev tutorials, but it doesn't really say that they are nix.dev, but we should do that more explicitly. And then not just start with the most simple use cases, such as finding and running packages, but also explain the main features of the ecosystem as it is right now. Right now, there's no real explanation of the difference between imperative and declarative package management. Right now, we don't really have a really good introduction to the Nix configuration language. And right now, we don't really have a clear distinction of how developing software using Nix, packaging software for Nix in the package collection, or managing your systems with Nix, how they really interact with each other. We only have components of these things. And as I said, one person cannot really change the big picture. There's just too many moving parts. And this is why this documentation team that we founded recently, 2 months ago, my vision for it is to kind of bring together all the expertise in the community and help shape that future. I wrote a little announcement, but really the point is easing Nix learning to the point that we have pathways into this jungle and pave more structured road systems, because the jungle won't go away. For example, the dichotomy between imperative and declarative package management, it doesn't go away because that's an integral part of Nix. What also won't go away is the old CLI and the new CLI, the non-flakes world and the flakes world. But we have to help people navigate these complexities. One of the distinguishing features of Nix is strong backwards compatibility, simply by the virtue of being able to reproduce age-old configurations. So people will have to navigate the options that Nix has offered during its course of history. And this is what essentially I'm working right now together with people from Summer of Nix and Domin and Mike92 from NixOS Wiki and everyone who's really interested. So, for example, Infinicial Sylvan has also been joining the documentation team while working on the Nix packages architecture effort, just to figure out strategies. What's in terms of like answering questions like what's the most impactful thing that we can do in a limited amount of time to help people grasping the right picture of what Nix actually is. And one of the questions that have been raised very quickly is, well, okay, so I found something out that I want to contribute. Where would I put that? And it turns out it's more, so documentation is more than just writing things down, how software works or how to use that software. It's really one level higher. It's really, how do we communicate in the community? Because, so the software that Nix is, we have the Nix package manager, and we have this huge collection of packages and Nix packages, but then we have also all these peripheral tools such as Niv and Home Manager, which is not an official Nix project. We have Deer End, which is kind of entangled into Nix with this Nix shell feature. All that software is really useless if it's not accessible to those people who need it most, those people who cannot write it on their own. So we need to communicate to these people outside of code. And if we want to help people get into that ecosystem, we have to tell them where to look for it. And so it turns out this documentation effort kind of got into a meta crusade in, well, how do we even organize our community knowledge? So what I did as a first draft in this documentation team is just figuring out how do things work right now. And in my impression, the discourse of the community is essentially the central hub for all the information. And a vision for what we could do in the future is start at discourse, lead people to discourse, and from there help them discover all the, when they want to contribute, help them find places to add their knowledge such that it can be discovered more easily. For example, if you find something, if you figured out how to deploy some service, you would just write it into the wiki. And if it turns out to be a very important thing that people do most of the time, we would eventually make it end up in the manuals or the nix.dev guide, depending on what kind of material it is. Whether it's reference, it should be in the manuals. If it's a guide, it should be on nix.dev. And then outsiders would just walk that graph upwards. And when they discover NixOS, they would first learn how to use it through the guides, and then go down into the reference manuals. And if those are incomplete, and they will be by definition because it's such a huge project, they will find additional information in the wiki, and although it should not be ideally, have to still delve into the source code. And if we don't have anything there, you will always be able to resort to discourse, ask questions, or find existing posts. So, so really, if you want to get engaged into documentation, what you should first do is engage in the community, as most people have done so far. But my goal for the future, maybe for the next 1 or 2 years, is to go away from the best way to learn Nix is to talk to people, like to sit together and someone shows you how to do it, someone shows you the relevant links, is that someone can actually do it on their own by just reading the relevant material and discovering what is the next step to do. And we're still working on this because, well, just gaining the overview is kind of a full-time job, and then writing it down properly is still even harder, as anyone will know who's ever written an academic paper. So the question is, what would that look like? One thing that I would like to do is just draw more overviews like these. I mean, this is already kind of a complex graph, but I came up with it in an afternoon just thinking about, okay, what are those components in the Nix ecosystem anyway? So we have the Nix package manager. It's, as John told us last time, it enables Hydra to build Nix packages. So Nix package kind of lives on top of Nix and Hydra. Then there's Niv, this external tool, which helps pinning Nix packages versions or external things, and so forth and so forth. And I hope that it will, if we place these things at the right positions, and if you break them down well enough not to look as complicated as this thing is, it will help people to gain a first impression of what will expect them. What I also think is that we should kind of change the way we teach Nix in those tutorials by setting expectations more clearly. For example, while working on the Nix language tutorial, I just noticed, well, yes, the Nix language is a simple language, but depending on your previous knowledge, it will just take a day or two to grasp the fundamentals. And then, as somebody pointed out, learning the Nix language is not just the language itself. It's also learning the standard library, so the built-ins, and also the library from Nix packages. But then again, you have the NixOS module system and all the particular language ecosystems that all they have their own idioms and their own ways of doing things. So just setting these expectations up front, I hope will help people well, plan the effort that is required to go on that path. And still, we need more actual user studies where we diligently document or observe neutrally what people really struggle with and what are their actual needs. And this is something that just needs time. And I hope that people will come up and help with this. So already I've seen a lot of contributions from the Summer of Nix participants who have been also struggling with some of the aspects of learning Nix. And what I would like everyone to do when they onboard into this ecosystem is to essentially follow the Boy Scout rule. If you see something that doesn't work out for you, write it down, and write it down publicly, and try to make a pull request or ask questions or add something to the wiki, so that the overall state of affairs will be improved little by little. And we from the documentation team are currently observing all these pull requests and all the issues and all the changes to NixOS Wiki, just to help people get their changes merged and to guide them to be effective contributors, even if they only want to spend half an hour on this. But then we have more broad issues which cannot be done with drive-by contributions. And I just did a little overview the other day to get an impression of what that may be. So what we're still missing, for example, is a non-technical introduction of why Nix is even relevant and how it works in non-technical terms. So we have this marketing page on nixos.org, but really it's still fairly technical. We don't have a learning roadmap, as I try to exemplify here. Like, if you want to tell someone what is Nix, you would have to kind of guide them through that thing, and we don't really have that yet. We currently have a Nix architecture, a part of a documentation for the Nix architecture, as I've shown in the beginning. I'm working on a Nix language tutorial, and then, so I've outlined some of these things. These are big endeavors, really. So it takes multiple days to even get to a point where it's better than what we had before. Because writing down something in an afternoon, that's possible. And we have tens of these blog posts and little notes and gists and what people do. But what we really need is concerted effort to polish not just the software surface, but the path that people take when they learn about and how to use Nix. And I hope that people will onboard with helping out with the little details, but I also really hope that things like the recent developments in the NixOS Foundation and the commercial interest that is rising in the Nix ecosystem will help financing the effort that is required to do that. So what right now is really exceptional is that I can take multiple weeks, more than 2 months of almost full-time work for doing this. And it seems right now I'm mostly the only one on the planet, it seems. And I hope that we can manage to have a more consistent work that is going into documentation and helping people learn. We have that on the development side in some sense. I mean, Elko is working for determinant systems. Theophan is working for Tweag. People are essentially doing continuous work on improving software. But what we also need, I think, is people continuously working on improving the people aspect, essentially, of people getting to use Nix and becoming part of the ecosystem and the community. And well, that's so far with documenting Nix and hopefully flattening the learning curve in the upcoming months and years.
Okay, Thank you very much, Valentin. That was very insightful. And our colleagues over on the sidelines, Solan and Attila, have been piling up the questions. So we'll go through those if that's okay with you.
Yeah, sure.
So first question that came in is from Solan. I tried to convert a few friends to Nix, or well, not convert, like introduce rather. They replied that they already had the packages in their Linux distribution that they needed, so they didn't see the point of using Nix, expect that it adds another layer of complexity. And then what kind of argument in favor of Nix would you use in these situations? And perhaps I'll also add a little bit to that question, can we document these advantages?
Well, I think these advantages have been documented or told a million times already, and I don't really see the point of repeating them, except for, well, it's a thing that you don't have to do again once it works. So that's, I think, my main argument for converting to Nix. But the thing is, it's a trade-off. If you have a large system, you will have large migration costs. So for example, if you have 1,000 packages that you already manage in your whatever you have, converting them to Nix will take ages, and it's natural. So the thing is, you will have to figure out what's worthwhile for you. And Nix does have, of course, Nix does have migration costs.
Yeah.
The question
Just
is,
like any other system in the world.
Just like any other system in the world, the question is, how long do you want to maintain the system? And what Nix promises is essentially that your long-term maintenance costs will hopefully go to zero.
That makes sense. Then Attila asked, is there a plan to create a specification for the Nix model? Ilko's thesis was written in 2003 and not many know what has changed since then.
Yeah, essentially that's part of documenting Nix architecture. What exactly the Nix model is, I'm not sure about the terminology here yet, but essentially I suppose it's the principle on which Nix operates, and I think that should be in the Nix documentation itself. It's how Nix works at an abstract level, where it's a different thing from the implementation, obviously, because that's source code.
Makes sense. And then another question from Attila. Where can one follow the progress of the documentation team and to see where to help and what to help with? Discourse, perhaps?
Yes, absolutely. Discourse. So we post the documentation team meetings on the Discourse documentation team category, or documentation category has been renamed recently. And from there, everything should be linked. All these things that I've just shown can be accessed on the internet, and if you want, we can post them to this video. And that is what I also encourage people to do, is if you want to tell people things, link all the relevant resources such that people can follow them. And the more links we have, the easier it should be to discover these information pieces.
Yes. Then Solan asked, when blocked with a Nix syntax question, it seems most people, including myself, often find the answer on GitHub gists. It seems the documentation lacks real-world examples that are easy to understand and absorb. How do you think this could be improved in the official documentation?
Good question. So yeah, that's a problem that I also perceive. So we have many bits of insightful information dispersed all over the place. We have parts in the NixOS wiki. I just recently discovered a little syntax overview in the Nix packages. No, actually in the NixOS manual. And then the Nix language, the Nix manual with the Nix language section also has an entire specification, which is also kind of incomplete. I think we should move all the reference style documentation into the Nix manual, and either have a kind of cheat sheet on the wiki or on the manual itself, and then have a collection of cookbooks or guides in one central place. It should be one place. Right now it's dispersed, and that's one of the efforts that's ongoing, and where anyone can easily help is just finding these instances and moving that information to a more relevant place. This is the diagram that I've shown, how information could flow in this ecosystem. Okay. That's something that anyone can help with.
Just as a librarian's job is to keep the library organized, a documentarian should also organize the documents then, I guess.
Exactly. But you have to take into account that it's just such a large system that no single person can do it. And that's the whole value of the community, that we can do that together, that anyone who stumbles upon something that's missing or broken or confusing, just help out. Just change that little bit. It will help enormously for all the people to come.
That makes sense. Then Solan asks, it's not always clear what Nix refers to. Is it the package manager, but also the language? What can we do with the language Nix?
Sorry, I didn't get the last question.
So I believe, like, what is it that we can achieve? What can we do with just the language itself, like Nix? And maybe also I'll extend it a little bit. Is there something that we can help people understand the difference between Nix, the language, Nix, the package manager, Nix packages, the package collection, etc.?
To answer the second question first, we should be very upfront with that as fast as possible. Yeah. Ideally, in my view, we should put that on the front page of the website and really explain that distinction. But that's a tough nut to crack because we have so many things depending on that front page. And so that's still an ongoing discussion. If you follow the meeting notes, you will see that we have already talked about this. And I want this to change. I want this to improve. But right now, I don't have a final answer. The other thing, what can we do with the Nix language itself? Well, the Nix language is fairly limited. It doesn't do all that much on its own. And people are right and left are rightly telling we could just replace it with anything else. It might be Haskell or Lisp or what name you, some kind of functional or pure language. The Nix language itself, I think, is not all that much valuable on its own. What makes it a key, a cornerstone of the ecosystem is the fact that Nix packages is written in it. And that's where all the value of the ecosystem lies, essentially. This is what John was talking about last time.
Yep. Then one more question, I believe, from Solan is, as the Nix documentation is published on the NixOS website, isn't it confusing for people, non-NixOS, that aren't interested in NixOS, but the package manager itself?
Yeah, it's absolutely confusing. I want this to change. As I said, it's a tough nut to crack. Yeah. So ideally, we would just have nix.org as a domain, and we've talked about this, but it's really expensive to buy, and this is a foundation topic, so the foundation board has to attack this.
Then Attila asks, is the official documentation format still Markdown, since he still saw a few doc-books being present?
Yes, the migration is unfortunately not entirely complete, and this is where help is highly appreciated. So it would be a lot of help if we could just finish this finally. Yeah.
Okay, so this is perhaps a low-hanging fruit where people can help off.
Absolutely, it's a fairly mechanical task, but you have to watch out a little bit. So.
Okay. And then Solan asks, in addition to the documentation effort, you didn't mention the man pages for the various Nix commands. Is there any plan to revamp them? I rarely find what I'm looking for in them.
Honestly, I haven't been working on that yet because I think the most important issue that we have is, as I try to outline, is to get people to understand how to navigate the documentation in the first place so they can learn more autonomously. But yeah, sure, if you care about it enough, please look into it. I would be really happy to help get change requests merged.
Okay. I also had a question of myself, and that plays into the low-hanging fruit that I just mentioned, that Attila said, like the Markdown versus dogbook thingy. Do you think there's other low-hanging fruit that people can very easily jump onto without too much fear of being judged, I guess?
Yeah, there's a bunch. So in that little graph that I've shown, how to add information and insights into the relevant documents, it's a whole post that I wrote for the Summer of Nix participants, but which really applies to anyone who wants to contribute to Nix. Okay. There's a bunch of long-standing issues that we can easily approach without much commitment. So one of them is helping categorize the NixOS wiki. So we have like 50 to 100 orphan pages which don't have a category, which are essentially not findable unless you know the terms to Google for. There's a few things that you can always do is figuring out what kind of information is missing from Nix packages. So I've told this multiple times now. So if you stumble into something that doesn't work for you, and it doesn't say anything about it in the manuals, and there's no information in the wiki, just add it to the wiki. If you see something in the wiki that is really polished and it just works, it should be in the manuals, probably. So if it's kind of, this is how it's done, and this is the interface that exists, put it into the manual. For example, we still haven't attacked it because there's so much to do. There's always much more work than we have time. There's no proper explanation of what NixOS modules are in the NixOS manual. It's in the NixOS wiki. Just move that article into the NixOS manual. That will be something that anyone could do at any point in time.
Yeah, that would make very much sense, actually. Perhaps more of a personal question. I have had to write documentation in the past as well, and I always got a little bit scared of publishing the documentation, if that makes sense, because I was afraid of it not being well written enough, or if there were too much spelling mistakes or just language or grammar mistakes. Is this something you think people should fear, or is it just publish it and people will, it'll evolve over time?
Yeah, I think language and grammar are really the least things to worry about. Although there's like two aspects to it. If you make a pull request and it's barely understandable, barely legible, that will probably not entice people to review it. So it should be at some humanely readable level. But you can always use online tools like Language Tool to fix that for you. Or just ask someone to review it first. Ask your friends, do you understand it? But other than that, small mistakes will always helpfully be, there will always be people helpful in fixing those. And also what I've also observed a lot of times is that if people actually introduce their misconceptions into their pull requests, there's usually someone who will say, wait a minute, this is not how it works. It's actually that way. And then these things will evolve naturally. And the other thing is, yes, please just add your contributions as you see fit. For example, it should be super easy to contribute to the NixOS wiki if you just find something. And don't be afraid of it being incomplete or not well worded. What you can always do to make sure is just ask someone who doesn't know and observe them interacting with that thing. It does take time, but that will make sure that you've struck the right angle and that that thing even makes sense. If people are still confused, then probably you should rework it.
That makes sense. And then we had a little talk before the lecture actually started, and you had mentioned a book that you didn't mention during your talk. That
yeah, right.
A source of inspiration.
Absolutely. A colleague recommended me the following book, which I always have on my table right now. It's called How Learning Works, and this is what I'm mostly basing my documentation work on, because it's something like a meta survey of the past 100 years of learning science, and very concisely and aptly explains how people construct their internal knowledge graph, as I would call it. And I highly recommend reading it if you want to try helping people acquire some skill or knowledge, because it's super helpfully written. I wish I could write as focusedly and concisely as they do in this book. Like it's, I would say for this line of work, it was life-changing to me.
Nice. I do not think there's any more questions. I myself also do not have any questions left. So I'd like to thank you, Valentin, for these amazing talk and insights on the NixOS documentation and trying to flatten the learning curve of Nix. And then I'd also like to thank our colleagues in the sidelines, Solen and Attila, for just pumping in the questions and making them come in. So yes, thank you again, Valentin.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
I wish you the best luck with the documentation.
Thanks.
If only my mic was unmuted, you would have actually heard what I said. I'm terribly sorry for that. So yeah, what I said is, since Valentin isn't here live currently, he will answer questions eventually in the Matrix channel. You can check that over below here. he'll either answer somewhere this evening or perhaps tomorrow, most probably tomorrow, but he said he'd try and answer them. I'd also still like to thank the people that made the Summer of Nix happen. Special thanks to, of course, the NLnet Foundation, the European Commission, the NixOS Foundation, and Tweag for their support in making all of these things come together and actually getting them out there. I hope you guys enjoyed this lecture. Next week, same time, we'll have a new lecture with Domen. We do not have a title for that yet, but keep an eye out on Discourse for that one. Thank you all for watching, and I wish you all a great night.